Now that we secured our new planet, the one that needed to be repaired from the massive amount of damage being done, along with the high amount of debris that's falling in through the atmosphere, being an M-class planet had a good atmosphere and was able to break up most of the space debris, but still there was a lot coming down. Basically, it was random artillery strikes landing all over the planet, slowly from each side of the planet, as everywhere had had some sort of space battle that happened, and a lot of this stuff was designed specifically not to overheat and break down, and would simply tumble into the atmosphere and causing untold damage and unknown casualties. We tried to mitigate as best we could, sent out all the salvage ships we could just to get anything away from there. Everything we picked up went straight into our fabricator systems, broken down, and as soon as our ships were repaired, they were simply melded into bricks. These bricks would be held in storage and kept in case we needed to trade with them, or if we needed to fabricate something else. Of course, the bodies were also put in the organic fabricators and made into their own type of bricks. Many of us, after a while, just cringed at the idea of this, as our hydroponics bays and all the other farming areas were churning out food at an alarming rate. It was amazing to see how well the plants were doing, along with the little bit of livestock that was here on this ship. We started breeding them as best we could, but there's only so much you can do with only so much genetic material to be spread around. I looked into the medical supplies to see if there's anything we could do to adjust them, but no, we simply had to trade out some of the males, but we wouldn't be able to do that until we got back to the Sol sector. There was nobody else here who had what we needed. So while we waited for that, we helped out on the planet. As shuttles went down towards the planet, bringing more supplies and more personnel, along with pulling out some refugees, we received more and more, just trickles, of the demonoids that were on this ship. I looked at my crew, and we had more, many more, than we absolutely needed to run this ship. So I realized that we needed to train as best we could. So during the time that folks were shuttled back and forth, and we started trading to different ships what we needed for different materials that we had, I worked with all the young ones and got them lined up as best I could. However, that was not the hard part. The hard part was dealing with the adolescents. The adolescents still had a drive in them, a drive to mate and to reproduce. This was difficult to deal with, especially since many of the females looked up to me as their most highly prized male mate on the ship, but I am the godfather. That would be messed up at a very high level. The even more messed up part is the fact that even though some of the males were interested in the females, from all the things they had to go through, as they were used as pleasure slaves many times as well, they would look at me and sometimes suggest different things, which I didn't tell them, but nauseated me. I simply told them if they had so much energy, they needed to go clean some conduits. Nobody enjoyed cleaning the conduits. Usually that was automated. But if somebody got in trouble, that was my go-to punishment. The conduits got kind of gross. Not always smelly, but just slimy and gross, which is why it's usually cleaned automatically every 3 to 4 hours. But nobody liked to do it. I did it one time. No thank you. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I'm good. All in all, it was very interesting to figure out what we would do with them, how we would figure out how the species would work, and I would get my answer later. But for now, it was still healing this planet. And while we sent more resources down and we built what we could to help them get on their feet, the native population, a strange type of mix between reptilian and avian, thanked us profusely every single time. Unfortunately, their species, being so close to a slave master's sector, was beaten down so much they didn't understand that we were not there to enslave them. We were there to free them. They didn't understand it for a long time. It wasn't until we got help from the Zells, the Chitters, the demonoids, and the veterans, and just showed them what was going on. With all the different species working together, they started to understand. The oldest ones didn't, as they were far too indoctrinated for decades, sometimes hundreds of years. They could not mentally break away. I believe they call that Stockholm Syndrome. The younger ones, however, were much more receptive and were able to understand that they did have freedom, but the way they understand the world is that of dominance and submission, and that would take over a generation to get out of them. Any culture based on dominance and submission becomes that of a socialistic culture, parasitic in nature, and will inevitably tear itself apart. The only other way they can survive is to build up their own nation state, militarily that is, and begin to reach out and take resources from others. We had to constantly remind them this was a bad idea. And when they asked why, our folks simply had to point to the nearest ship and then point to the nearest dead slave master body and ask them, "You face that. Do you want to be that?" They would simply look at the rotting corpse of the slave master and understand. But it would take, again, a long time. While we continued to fix their infrastructure, it was very clear that the slave masters did not like the fact that we were so close. We could see ships coming in from FTL and random locations. They would always stop short and try to get as much intel as possible, and as we got close again to take them out, they would simply go away. As many drones as we may have now, as the fabricators worked tirelessly to create them, they cannot be everywhere in space at once. Did we get a few? Of course. But most of them would get in and get out before we were able to shoot them. The ships that were coming in were not designed for combat. One of our reports was able to scan one of them. It had a grand total of 3 point defense weapons on it. These are mainly for knocking space debris away. They're not offensive in any stretch, unless you are broadsiding somebody at point blank range. And what idiot gets in point blank range in space combat? It's nothing but empty space. All in all, it was pretty clear they were either trying to size us up to see if they could send a force, or they wanted to know what type of force was heading their way. I'm sure they were getting a little antsy at the idea as we stayed there around the planet, still shuttling resources back and forth, making sure that everything was lined up. While this was all happening, our allies were busy. The Chitters were able to take 2 more planets in a single sector, as not every sector only had 1 planet that was habitable. They were able to take over these sectors with almost minimal losses, at least their version of losses, as they produced personnel at far higher rates. And they began to call us to make sure we knew that they had refugees, and these refugees had to get back. I let the fleet know that I was leaving, and to make sure they held on to any demonoids they may find, but at this point I doubt they would find any more, and I turned the ship, and we went over to meet up with the Chitters. It took 3 jumps to get there, and when we got there, we saw that the Chitter fleet had been busy. They had torn the other group apart, and I mean into little, tiny little bite-sized pieces. There was nothing of note out there. I told my crew to be ready, but mainly get the salvage ships ready to rock and roll, because we're going to have to get as much as we can. With that, I had to clear it with the Chitter High Command, and they were not happy that we were intentionally planning on getting any of the resources. They claimed they needed them. You know what? They took the planet. It's their salvage. I immediately recalled our ships and told them to drop off any salvage in the nearest Chitter ship and to come back. They all responded and, without question, completed that mission. As I pulled this very large ship up next to the Chitter flagship, I'm sure they looked at it strange, as the Chitter flagship was only a third the size of this one. Yet I could see from the way its weapons were that it was much better armed. That thing was a warbird if I had ever seen one. Behind us, as we were just docking, I could see several other ships coming in. Zell transports were now on approach, as they knew that they had refugees on this planet as well, and they wanted their people out. I can't say I blame them. The Chitters have ruthless efficiency, and when I say ruthless, I mean that to the fullest extent. As the drones, especially those below the rank of Beta, tend to be almost mindless in their attacks. It won't be until they get to a certain level of evolution that they finally get the wherewithal to not actually just kill everything. We saw this as many of the slaves had been torn up right next to the slave masters. I gave the Chitters a piece of my mind, and the Alphas said that they would send this message back to their queen, as my name still held a lot of sway everywhere. I did not try to overuse it, but I did use it to get all the demonoids I could, and at least 5 dozen humans as well. Most were intact, mainly, you could say that. Many were missing things like an eye, an ear, a couple of fingers. One was missing half his leg. It was a mess. We had to get them on the ship and straight into the medical bay. They were not happy with the idea of aliens they had barely ever seen before doing any type of surgery on them. But the training I gave my crew was very intensive, and they would know everything that was on this ship. It didn't matter if it was the engines, the medical, the fabricators, the fighters, the helm even. Every single one of them was able to plug into the command couch and run this ship if need be. Because that's the way we roll. And it did not take long as the most damaged of humans were put back together, along with most damaged of demonoids. To my shock and surprise, we found a couple of doctors on this. Actual no-shit MDs. They were so grateful to see us, as they were one of the first ones that were taken. They were sent up to find more about the biological systems of the aliens that were taking us. What they ended up finding out is that they were simply slaves to patch up others for gladiatorial events and housework. It was horrible for them, as they would work 18 to 20-hour days, even though humans can survive off about 4, maybe 5 hours of sleep without totally breaking apart. Try doing that for several years and see how well you do. When I found this out, I got a hold of the captain of the Chitter fleet. I told him, simply put, the next time I would like as many humans back alive, along with as many demonoids alive, please let your drones know. Aside from that, I saw what they did to our people. I have no problems with what you did to them. The Chitter moved its antenna and its shoulders in a way that shows that it was smiling. It was happy with these words. I, on the other hand, was more interested in just making sure everyone was set. As we got the humans over towards the chow hall, they dove into the food. This would be the first time they had non-manufactured or fabricated food in over a year, and they loved every single bite. In fact, it got a little bad. Several of them dove into our hydroponics bay and started ripping the plants apart. We had to send security details, but when they backhanded one of the young females that was telling them to get away, oh, that's the last time that's ever going to happen. I grabbed that son of a bitch by the throat and I dragged him out of there, smacking his head on the ground every 3rd or 4th step. With that, I chucked him into an airlock, locked the door, and he was going to stay there for the rest of the trip. I let everyone know what happened on that. The only other issue I had was a few thought that the demonoids were, since they're so pretty, were there for more of their amusement than anything else. I again had to put it out on the PA system for them all to hear that they are not to even think of harming my crew, or I will make sure they go back to the slave masters and be told that, hey, here's your lunch. At that point, if any of them had any questions about that, they could go back to Airlock 2 Bravo. And they could see the guy scared to death that at any moment I would open the exterior hatch and blast his sorry ass into space. It was around that time that everyone seemed to calm down, and I was able to brief them on what had happened. They finally understood why I was so agitated, not just because they had injured one of my crew, but for the fact that food itself was such a high-priced commodity. It would not surprise me that pirates would try to take this ship because of the food that was on board. They didn't understand that until I showed the photos and the video of Earth. Large swaths were still nothing but black char, basically magma on the surface, just seared shut. It was just insane. A few of them cried. Some passed out. One poor lady pissed herself. The rest of them were simply in shock at what had happened. And I reminded them, this is what we're fighting for. And this is also my ship. I didn't have any problems with them after that. I simply registered them and sent the names back to the command ship so that they could relay things back to Earth. My ship may be good, but I can't launch a signal 7 sectors away and get it there in any type of speed. Things still need to be couriered their way across. The command would simply send it to the next transport that was heading back to Earth to let them know we had found their people. And I also had to find out where in the hell they had to be. But I wouldn't know until we got back to the Sol sector. When the planet was completely secured and we made sure there was no more humans or demonoids there, I took another couple of the veterans and I told them that I would drop them off on their planet on the way through. Which I did. It was actually on the way back. 2 jumps away and we were there. I contacted their fleet and they came and actually got their own people. So happy. And to my absolute shock, the executive officer on one of their ships opened up the doors, dropped to one knee, opened his arms up, and he seemed to give out a strange, almost deep meow. And at that point, I heard what kind of sounded like a high-pitched hiss and a squeal, and a young female ran into his arms. It turned out it was his daughter. His daughter had been taken out of his arms a year prior and was now back with her father. It's moments like this that make you think about, was all this worth it? And in that one perfect moment, it was. And I had nothing but good things to say about that. I made sure that our videos captured the entire thing. I made sure it was subtitled, of course, because most people just couldn't understand the language right away. But that video, when we got back to the Sol sector, was spread to everyone. Anyone who ever questioned that our great crusade was ever worth questioning. They simply had to see that video, and they would understand. Along with that, when we got back to the Sol sector, we ended up finding out whether they were being sent to Mars, Venus, one of the moons, wherever humans would want to be. I had no problem flying them to each of these planets, as it didn't cost anything to me. The gravimetric drives, once built, will go pretty much forever unless damaged. I say pretty much forever because parts do wear out. All in all, though, most of them settled on Mars, 10% on Venus, and only 1 decided to go to Luna. Even the one on our makeshift brig, which was airlocked to Bravo, decided to end up on Mars. It was nice to see everyone returned, and everyone was, again, so happy to get their family members back after so long. Many of them honestly looked like crap. But we had other issues to deal with once the last human was taken care of. I had to put a broadband out for everyone to see, saying that I needed to trade animals. I needed something to breed in so that we had better genetic codes. Of course, I was inundated with many people wanting the studs that I had, willing to very much trade theirs. It took a long time to swap out who or what males were going to be swapped out. One of them actually claimed that they would sweeten the deal as they had a demonoid that wished to get back into space. As of which one? What are you talking about? Turns out my former XO had a falling out with his wife over the fact that he could not give her children. I told him to hang on. I'll be back to Venus in a few hours. Just wait there. When I finally got to Venus, I went to talk to him. Apparently, it was a major area of contention. Not only do the demonoids not age, but the fact that they don't produce children is difficult to wrap your brain around. Many of us humans, we had gotten used to the fact that we look young thanks to medical technology. We're basically immortal ourselves now, so I very much didn't understand the problem until I met his former fiancée. She's from a very religious family where they intend to have a lot of children. I simply said, let's go talk to the doc. We went to a geneticist to see what we could do, and we ran everything that we possibly could think of, at least what he could think of. What he didn't know is that my own crew had looked into this problem and had actually found a way for them to produce children. It was unbelievably simple. The fact that even though their body did not produce the sperm cell required, it wasn't without genetics in the fluids that they secrete. It was not difficult at all to fertilize the egg itself. It was actually technology we had back before this whole craziness even started. And when I brought this up to the former fiance, she was absolutely flabbergasted. I was like, what in the hell happened to you guys? Did your brains go so far in the future you forgot the past? They all kind of looked at each other and realized that they had done screwed up. And with that, they were together again. And I knew this would bring some issues when it came to my crew, but I wasn't worried about it too much at the moment. For right now, all I needed to do was swap some animals, get some extra seeds, well, trade seeds actually, and move on, which we did. As we moved out and back towards the front, I got word that the fleets were getting ready to move again. This would be against the very close slave trader homeworld, the ones that kept checking on us to see what they might be facing. But they had forgotten something from the previous battle, at least it seemed. We're like wolves. This wolf pack, there's a reason why we call ourselves a wolf pack. Is we may run alone, we may be out and about ones, twos, threes at a time, but we will always come together to take down much, much larger prey. And taking down a homeworld is going to prove to be a real bitch. On that note, as I got close, I began to send a message towards the fleet, asking the command where they wanted me. I had a ship that was extremely strong, and I had a full complement of fighters. In fact, we had started fabricating extra fighters. Unfortunately, I didn't have as many trained pilots at that point to fill them out, but we had enough. If they needed extra fighters, we would trade for extra fighters. It's not going to be hard. With that, they simply said, don't worry, the drones will take care of it. If it's a terrestrial fight, we'll let you know. Okay. And with that, my orders were fourth line. I was a little put down by this, and so was the rest of my crew, as they wanted a piece of these slave masters, always thinking about how bad they were treated by these things. Oh boy, they were more than a little pissed when they were told that they had to stand down and wait until called. I had to explain to them that if we sent every single ship to the orbit of the planet, we'd end up shooting each other or running into each other. That's how much we will fill up the entire planet, just outside the atmosphere. Even if we went standard lunar orbit, solar system lunar orbit, we would, in space terms, we would be shoulder to shoulder with people, and we wouldn't even be able to dodge fire coming at us. We would just have to sit there and take it. You can't do that. It's not the way battles are done. Why? Because surviving is always number one on the list. No man ever won a war by dying for his country. That's just common frickin' sense. So they would be on standby. Those that weren't in fighters, I told them to make sure they took care of their duties for that day. Aside from that, they can watch everything that happens. As we got ready to jump in, we had only been in the sector for about maybe 35 minutes when we were given the word that the fleet was moving out. I waited till our turn. Fourth line means you jump in the fourth one in line. You don't jump in with the main fleet. So we would miss most of the fireworks that started off. However, we wouldn't be jumping straight to their planet. Their planet was, by their sector, the second planet from their star, and their third, and their fourth, and their fifth. Yes, they had 4 different planets that were very well guarded, very well maintained. Many of them probably covered in slaves. So we would need the combined fleet just to take this sector down. This is why I knew it was going to be one hell of a slog. As I watched the first ones of the ships start to blink out into FTL speed, I watched and waited for the human ships to use their fold systems. Fold system was still something that only humans used. And we were the only ones crazy enough to try it. But in a moment, I saw the strange glow that came from them. It seemed like almost a ball of light shimmered around the ship for just a moment. And then, poof, it's gone. It's just not there anymore. The space folds in between the 2 ships, and then from point A to point B becomes less than a micron, and poof, you're on the other side. The whole process is a bit jarring if you're not ready for it. If you're ready for it, it's barely like you don't even really feel it, honestly. It's like you just farted and moved in your seat a little bit. As we got ready for our jump, we watched the other groups begin to go in the FTL speed and jumping. And I had to sit there and wait. The first group was almost completely made up of dreadnoughts and battleships. They were going to bring their big guns in first. Behind them was destroyers, frigates of that nature, anything they would need to back up the big guns. Right behind that was going to be the carriers. The only reason they were left in third line is because carriers may be massive, but they're also rather fragile considering their size. The area must be clear. They can't take a bunch of strafing runs, or you can forget about having a carrier after that. After that was support units, which is what I was. Unfortunately, this ship was not designed specifically for frontline combat, even though it could give some of the best battleships a run for their money. We just don't have the guns that they do. The massive turrets that are strapped on all 4, sometimes 6 sides of those battleships are just not present on this ship. And those turrets can sheer clear through an enemy dreadnought like it's not even there, stem to stern. It's a nice way of saying you're going to rip it a new one. And then it was about our time. I called for everybody to stand by for jump. I say again, stand by for jump in 3, 2, 1. And with that, we jumped. The shimmy happened, and poof, we were there. I scanned with everything we could. Our AI was scanning as well, looking for anything in our area, any type of ordnance, any type of ship, anything that might be a threat to us as we moved our way through the sector. But there was nothing. The dreadnoughts, the destroyers, they had all done what they were supposed to do. Even the cruisers, which I still didn't understand why you make a light battleship, were doing a wonderful job. And as we continued forward, we could see what they were doing. Our AI, our drones, were leading the charge, trying to stay out of the way of the guns, ducking, bobbing, and weaving as enemy fire came in. Many of them firing all sorts of chaff and decoys, just trying to keep the fire away from the dreadnoughts and the battleship, which is exactly what they needed to do. The AI must have been upgraded because the way they were moving was almost human in a way. yet it was moving so fast and moving so much that I could tell there was no, shall we say, meat bags on board. If there were, they would have turned themselves into chunky salsa as their spine went through their brain and their butt at the same time. It's not a fun idea to think about. Just as the enemy fleet realized that the drones were a major threat, the drones seemed to separate just enough to allow the dreadnoughts and battleships to fire their main guns as they entered weapons envelope. By then, the torpedoes were already making contact and tearing apart the front lines of the enemy ships. The enemy didn't know which way to turn because the combined fleet was striking from every sector. This was a 7-pronged attack. That way they couldn't bring all their weapons to bear at the same time. As we brought in ours, the first ones to jump in, the enemy thought this was the main attack, so they turned all their weapons towards us. By the time they realized what was going on, the FTL ships were starting to come in left, right, and center to the different points and were able to fire full on with their main guns before the enemy could adjust their own weapons. Catching them by surprise was going to cut them down piecemeal. We sent out a message, and by we, I mean the combined fleet. The message was simple. Stand down your fleet and surrender all your slaves, or we will come and take them from you. And you will not enjoy when we do that. For over 38 hours, the space battles continued. Torpedoes launched, main guns, missiles, energy weapons strafing the sky. Everything was lit up as the combined fleet continued to move towards the home system. As they sectioned off one planet, they surrounded it, making sure they were out of weapons range, even though they had taken the satellites down. Who knows? Maybe they had ground-based space artillery. We didn't know. These guys weren't stupid, and we weren't going to think they were. To our absolute shock, it wasn't the first planet we took, but the second one actually did have ground-based spaced artillery. Unfortunately for them, they didn't realize their recoil was going to be such a problem. Their trajectories were off as the huge rounds just flew right by the ships. Only once did they graze one of the dreadnoughts. Though causing massive damage where it hit, it only grazed it. And we were grateful for that. With the first planet being taken, the slave masters, many of them, dropping their weapons and dropping to their knees, begging for forgiveness as they brought their own slaves out and told the slaves to run to us. We told the slaves to stop in whatever language we could find, but many of them were confused. The slave masters told them to run, but others who were holding weapons were telling them to stop. What were they supposed to do? We told them to stop for one simple reason. We did not know if they were a decoy. We didn't know if they were an ambush. We didn't know if those slaves were a Trojan horse. And in many cases, as we told the children to stop, or anybody to stop, they froze in place, and the slave master, even if it wasn't them, somebody would trigger something, and there was an explosion. We had to watch the slave be blown to pieces. Many times our own soldiers would get caught up in the blast, but the exosuits would protect us mostly. I mean, concussive force is concussive force after all. You can only do so much with it. And ending up on your back is just going to ring your bell a certain way. But every time they did this, each of the freed peoples, the freed species, would come at those slave masters with reckless abandonment. They would leave nothing there to even be identified as one of the slave masters. Oh no. They would remove the hands, the feet, the arms, the legs, yes, separately. And then they would slowly rip the torso apart. And if that thing was still alive, they would slowly rip the head off the body. It was gruesome. Sometimes the humans, I had to say this might be a little too far, but threatened with a monomolecular cutter. This thing could cut through a bulkhead, and it's about the size of a katana. A few folks thought they'd be more inventive and actually make ones shaped like broadswords, so it was easier for them to handle. Whenever they wanted information, they simply would draw this sword in front of the slave master and say, you got two choices. You can either answer me or you can end up like this rock. And they would slice the rock in half with one hand and then aim the sword at them, and then say, "It's your choice, what'll it be?" The slave masters, many of them, still on the grounds, begging for their lives, would simply give up all the information. That first planet was taken in less than 24 hours. Again, most of them, the slave masters, surrendered. They did not fight. They knew they had been taken, and they knew what could happen to them if they even thought about resisting. And with that, we did take POWs. For the first time in a long time, we took the slave masters prisoners. Some of the ships next to me were actually called forward to retrieve them. I was also called forward, as there were more of the kind I was supposed to protect. The demonoids there, they were the ones I was tasked to protect and provide for. I told my crew to get ready. Those in fighters, you had the choice to stay ready in your fighters or actually be ready for when the new crew members come in. To my surprise, there was barely a dozen demonoids. I asked down to command, "Is this it? This can't be it. How can it be it? This is their home planet. Where's the rest of them?" They never did answer, except to say, "That's all we found." It's a good thing, too, because if they had told me that the slave masters had gone overzealous and killed all the rest of them on this planet, I would have told my crew weapons free and let them cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, and not a single one of those bastards would have got off that fucking rock. But I wouldn't find that out till later. By the time I got the new members onto the ship, I ran back to greet them. They were scared to death of a human because this is the first time they had seen one outside of the exosuits. They didn't even know what I was. I simply introduced myself, and the rest of the demonoids helped them out. The first thing they did was they got them food and medicine. Though their species only eats about maybe half of what a human needs to survive, they were still hungry. Many of them so emaciated they had to be carried. I couldn't figure out why. Again, this was a home planet. Resources should have been coming in like crazy. My rage was building as I went back to the command couch, plugged in to see what was going on. The second planet had already been invaded, sectioned off from the other two, and it was being invaded full force. Not only were the drop pods flying in, which meant there was a lot of resistance on the ground, but I saw chitters going in with their transports, and even Zell and veterans, they were going in as well, even though in smaller numbers. As they all hit the ground, I saw on many of the video feeds the absolute hell that was happening on the planet. This was not quite their homeworld, but the slave masters were still fighting for it. For every single square meter that was there, they would have us try and pay in blood. But they underestimated us. Our exosuits could take most of what was thrown at them. Their lighter handheld munitions, what we would consider a pulse pistol, simply refracted off the shields of the exosuits. The metal was just too damn thick for them to go through. It was also heat resistant, so it's not like their energy weapons are going to do much. However, as they started to realize that they could use solid projectiles or a type of artillery, that worked a little better. So our men did what they were supposed to do. They charged the cannons and went charging straight at them. Before the enemy could even bring their cannons high enough to arc the rounds or low enough to fire directly, our men were all over them, tearing them to pieces. Many of them even using those monomolecular cutters to slice right through the artillery pieces, scaring the living shit out of the slave masters. Those slaves that were arming the guns looked at us with complete fear, but were surprised when we simply ran past them. I smiled as I realized what they were doing. The slaves that were manning the guns were simply stunned. They stood there, confused. They couldn't fire. They had no other orders what to do. And all the slave masters were being subdued. They weren't given any orders. What were they supposed to do? It was of sheer delight as I saw many of our human friends and along with our allies, reaching up and destroying those stupid frickin' collars they had on the slaves. As I watched on the video, I saw a single demonoid. I couldn't tell from the angle if it was male or female, but it was purple. And they're the only species that I know without feathers that is purple. At least some of them are. I immediately started moving the ship into position, calling up command and saying that I'm coming in. I see that you got refugees, so I'm getting closer. They yelled at me to not get too close as I would start banging into the other ships. This thing was massive, as big as a dreadnought, so it was difficult for others to work around me. I told them I would stay on second line if need be, but I wanted to get them out. And if you want, I can send even more forces down. This was again rejected, as they didn't want even more forces running onto each other. I could understand that, of course, as things can get very jumbled very quickly. That second planet was eventually taken, though it took over 3 full days to take it down, at least one continent. It would take 2 weeks before the entire planet was taken. Many of the forces they faced were dug in like ticks, and we had to dig them out. But they did not realize that we already had mastered this type of combat decades ago. And we brought out an old piece of equipment that was unbelievably effective. As they stuck the nozzle of the flamethrower into the bunker and topped off that pilot light, it was insane, the burst of fire that came out. I said a little prayer, as I did not know if there were other slaves inside. I cared not for the slave masters, but those that they were holding as shields I felt sorry for. But this was the only way to do it without wasting so many of our people that any victory would taste as bitter as defeat. While this planet was being taken, the other two were still being attacked. Their fleets were pretty much in tatters before the second planet was finally taken. I was still collecting refugees as I looked out to see what was going on the other 2 planets. And yes, the only one that still had any functioning space combat was the home planet itself. They were defending that son of a bitch tooth and nail, and understandably so. But what they didn't understand was as soon as the last of the space forces were dealt with, the home planet was not fired on. It was simply sent the same message over again. Release your slaves, or we will come and get them. If we have to forcibly remove slaves from your care, we will kill every last one of you. I await your response in 24 standard hours. Which, if you calculate it, was about 31 human hours. But we didn't have to worry about that too much. At that point, I simply sat back and watched. Many of the remaining slaves that would be demonoids were returned to my ship. I didn't have to go anywhere. I simply looked at the way it was done, and I was grateful that they'd learned to use these biological and chemical weapons to knock out the majority of the populace, or else these invasions would have been far longer and much, much bloodier. The humans were kind of laughing at the idea of these slave masters begging for their lives, but one of the reasons they almost didn't raise their hands or their heads is because they were so tired they couldn't do it. It was kind of funny to think about that they honestly were so tired they couldn't fight. It's like trying to fight somebody who's got a hangover. Which is also why, when the 4th and final habitated planet inside the sector was taken, we received word from the home planet. It simply said, we will give you what you wish. We will, however, we do not wish to be destroyed. So if you stop. We actually had to listen to this stuttering. All I could think of was, who the hell is in charge? What in the hell? Eventually, I heard the commander send down a message. Be clear and concise on your message. Do you or do you not accept the terms? We will return your people from this sector. In return, you will surrender your slaves and you will restrict yourself to your home planet. Do you accept these terms? Yes or no? There was no response for about 20 minutes. Then they responded, yes, we will send you up our servants. If you will send us our people, and we will, yes, we will. That's not part of the deal, the commander yelled back. You will gather your slaves in one spot. We will come down to inspect to make sure they're okay. We do not trust your shuttles to bring them up. We will bring down your people in our shuttles, so I suggest you don't do anything stupid like firing at them. If you eliminate these shuttles, or if you try to booby trap the slaves, or if you do any type of items that might even be considered deceptive, I will allow my people to simply glass your planet the way you tried to glass ours. Do you understand? Yes, we understand. Yes, we understand. We will do. We will do as you say. I watched as the shuttles went down towards the surface, loaded with POWs, and then came back. One of the shuttles, I watched as it went up towards the flagship, suddenly hit one of its maneuvering thrusters and headed towards me. I was shocked when they told me they had more for me. I'm like, crap, where do I put them all? I'm running out of room exceptionally quick. I knew that this ship could house a lot of personnel, but holy jumping Jehoshaphat's, what in the hell? I would have to get a bigger ship. Hint, hint. As they finally cleared the planet, they began to send all sorts of salvage teams out. The salvage teams would go and pick up all the debris around so that those on the planet would not be prey to the salvage falling to the ground. Those on other planets were simply brought to the home world. Their own systems, their own governance, whatever it might be that was on those other planets, pretty much evaporated as there was no one there. The slaves were all removed, and the slave traders, the slave masters themselves, were now restricted to their own planet under threat of death. And with this, we allowed their 4.8 billion personnel to survive. A small number for a planet that size, yet more than enough to keep their species alive. We sent them a warning that if they ever try to enslave another species, we will return, and there will be no warning, and there will be no survivors. As we cleared up the area, we started to realize that we had a lot more of non-organic material than we expected. My cargo holds were filling up so fast that I was having to fill up around the fighters. Many of the fighters couldn't even deploy now. There were so many bricks of just inorganic material that it was insane. And all of this could be traded. This was money to us. This was currency. And yet, what was also currency was the amount of bodies we were able to pull out of the ether. And each of those bodies was stripped down and sent into the organic fabricator as it began getting disintegrated. Many of the crew just couldn't sit and watch the bodies get defabricated as it was. So I set up a system where they wouldn't have to. They simply had to let the body float in by, well, I turned the gravity off, and they used magnetic clamps on their shoes to stay down. So they would simply let the body float towards the defabricator, and then a wall would go up. It would come back down when it was done through its processes. The whole process was actually disturbing if you like to watch things being taken apart atom by atom on the outside, and you could see what makes them tick on the inside as they are taken apart and broken down into their base organic material. But these organic bricks, the loss of life, was something we could use to create life on our own planets. We found out very quickly as I went back to find out if I could get a larger ship, as I was now had people doubled up in their beds. I didn't have enough room. And because I had listened to them and I had helped everyone out, my reputation did again precede me, though not enough where I was first up on the fabricators. But instead they sent me to our new, larger fabricator that was finally finished about a month before I got back. With this, they would make me a new ship, exactly to my specifications, even though it would take another 3 months for the fabrication process to complete itself. I would be able to have this colonization ship so that I could land on any planet so that the demonoids could actually live out their lives. I kind of laughed at this, as the demonoids didn't care about living on a planet at all. Though they cared about the fresh food, don't get me wrong, what they cared about was living out in the stars with me. I couldn't help but smile at this. As I watched the old ship get defabricated, I kind of laughed at the idea that we would now have our own colony, our own mobile colony. And with the new technology mixed in with the old, this is now a functioning and potentially growing colony. And yes, I did put a nursery in. Actually, several. I wasn't sure what the future was going to hold at this point. We had taken down one of the 5 major slave traders in the universe, and it's a big fucking universe. So we had pissed off all of them and made them nervous. We knew this. Reports came in from all other places as ships were being taken down onesie, twosies at a time, those that flew into sectors that we now controlled. It didn't matter which part of the combined fleet took it. They all shared the information. As it turns out, the slave masters we had taken their home planet still had many sectors under their control, but they had splintered now. Though I knew that they would want their home planet back, once they knew that their home planet was still intact, they were very, very hesitant to pick a fight with us. They knew now that we could take their planet and just end it. To our absolute shock and surprise, they tried to barter with us. They tried to barter by trading in all their slaves so that they could return home. Well, that's not my call. That call is to the council itself. But I will be there as my ship is being fabricated and my crew, my colony, is waiting for it to be done. They know to protect each other so that no one takes advantage of them. As they wait, I will head down to the council and give my 2 cents on this. And by the time I return, the new ship will be complete. I really want to see how well the crew takes to it. I just hope they take to it better than most of our new crew members when I tell them, you gotta at least wear pants.